I got a question for you. When we compare between Microsoft or Linux and Apple, how do you rate their security in terms of the operating system security? So you are a researcher, so from your perspective, what do you find are the pros and cons, and whom do you find more secure than the other?
Great question. And so I think that, so we'll just kind of go through one by one. So Windows has made great strides. They got beat up kind of in the early 90s, or mid 90s and the early 2000s, and their security was pretty terrible. And then they implemented kind of the secure software development lifecycle, which really has become kind of a model for the entire industry. And so they've really made great strides. So that blue pill attack, the hypervisor attack, that won't work in Windows 8 because Windows 8 by default will insert just an empty hypervisor in there to prevent another hypervisor from loading, and they will actually prompt the user saying, hey, someone is trying to load themselves into a very privileged spot. Is that something that you're doing? Did you try to run VirtualBox or Xen, or is that something that you weren't expecting? And so that I think is a great step forward. Windows 8 64 also removed a lot of backward support for DOS, which is where a wealth of bugs were. And then also now they moved to EFI, which is a more secure BIOS. And within that, they've actually added some trusted secure boot. And so that allows you to make sure that your Windows operating system hasn't been compromised. So before that, you didn't really realize, if someone had kind of modified a kernel DLL or a kernel file, you weren't really sure who you were trusting anymore. And now, the Windows 8 with this trusted boot will actually have, signed updates that, you can verify have come from Microsoft. So you're kind of minimizing your TCB right there. And so that's really great improvements from Windows. And I think that, if you look at the Pwn to Own, which is a hacking contest held every year where you get, you can go to one link on one computer for OS X, Linux, and Windows. And if you can hack that computer, you get to, the very expensive computer that was running as a kind of a gift and $10,000. And so it seems like lately Windows has been the hardest to compromise, and they've been doing a very good job of being very proactive in preventing zero-day attacks, as well as kind of verifying that what they do have in the kernel hasn't been modified. So Windows, I think, is doing very, very well, and I think for the most part is really up there. The issue with Windows is there's a lot of legacy applications which you might need to turn some of those features off for, and that's really your risk with Windows. Linux, I would say, supports all these features as well, but it requires a huge amount of manual configuration. So Linux can prevent some of these hardware attacks, but you need to put in special code into your kernel boot options, which don't come by default. And so there's a lot of things that you kind of need to, just like in Linux, typically you kind of you have a toolkit and you have a lot of different options, and you really need to configure that system specifically. And so I would say out of the box, Linux is much more difficult to get kind of from turnkey solutions, more secure. OS X, I think, is also trailing a little bit more, and I would say that it's trailing more so than Linux because sometimes a lot of those options just aren't exposed to the user. They're doing a really good job in their iOS security, and I see a convergence between iOS and OS X, but currently I would say that just very recently they moved to a 64-bit kernel which had strong return-oriented programming attack defenses. So I would say that they're behind the curve, and generally they're compromised faster than the Windows counterpart.
So that's very interesting, Jacob, because if you just look at the common man's perception, they somehow feel that Windows is a lot less secure. But I mean, we in the field of security, we know that Microsoft really made some great contribution in the field of security, and they were at one point of time very, very insecure, and there are probably a lot of these vulnerabilities and attacks on Windows, but the reason why they're attacked is probably because they are more popular and not necessarily because they're more insecure. So it's great to know what you mentioned about the Windows and Linux and OS X. And I got another follow-up question related to this. We also got this mobile the mobile operating system, the desktop or the server operating system, then the virtual operating system. So among these flavors, how do you see the security as? Like, which of these ones are more mature, and what are some of the common pros and cons?
Sure. So I would say that, in the mobile space, iOS is a clear front runner. It's very, very difficult to jailbreak your iPhone lately. I mean, for the developers creating the jailbreaks, and the isolation between different applications is very strong. They also have now a lot of trust and measurement built into their capabilities. You can actually find Apple's security designs for iOS. It was an excellent read. And so they're really doing, I think they're the head. What you sacrifice is the ability to say, I would say, own your device. And so we're kind of on the PC side and even the desktop and Mac laptop side, we're used to being able to kind of go under the hood and change certain features and being able to do what we want, write untrusted code and have full access and have administrator access. iOS is really trying to kind of gain people's tolerance for not having administrator access on a device that they own, which is, from a business perspective, is excellent. They can create a walled garden. They can really tie you in there. From a security perspective, it's also really good because I would trust an Apple security engineer more than I would trust the average user of a mobile device. And so by kind of removing those abilities to kind of shoot yourself in the foot, Apple's doing a really great job. Android is more from the Linux perspective, and so they're a little bit more, a lot of times it's very easy to root your device, or it's something that you can kind of just configure, and it's, you can unlock your bootloader very easily to give you that full Linux environment and to be able to really own your device. But at the same time, it's also been very easy for an attacker to do that and be able to kind of escalate out. And so you'll see a lot of Trojan applications and privilege escalation attacks against Android, where you'll see much, much fewer for iOS. And I think that as that iOS model becomes more and more accepted and mainstream, I've also seen OS X become more and more constrained as well. So now, if by default you open an application that's not signed by Apple on your OS X system, it won't let you run that application. You have to go and specifically allow that application. So that's something that you're kind of seeing is it's kind of preventing this, it's kind of pushing this app store and walled garden and everything is safe in here model down to the desktop. And so I see that kind of as that, the average user sees that as becoming more and more acceptable. I think that the operating systems running on your desktop and your servers will begin to improve as well in that same, as long as you're willing to make that trade-off. Server systems, those are ones where you need root access. You need to be install custom software and be able to, tune the kernel and the performance. And so those are going to be, typically, Linux or Windows, but those ones are typically run by a much more, experienced system administrator. And so I see that, turnkey Linux and the Windows solutions now are running under hypervisors, providing more isolation and more of a VPS environment where even if there was a compromise, it's only maybe one application and it can't break out of the hypervisor. So that's kind of across the board. So I think that iOS is in the lead, and I think iOS will start to change how users view device ownership, and that will slowly kind of bleed through into laptop and desktops, and then security will follow from that.
That's a great point. Sometimes having less control is good. Less choices and less control could be good for us, though we tend to go and choose for, more choices, but sometimes it's bad for us.